I think the system they're setting up, I mean, the goal is to have the US dollar, Bitcoin, and stablecoins all be part of the same ecosystem. And you see, prominent Bitcoin banks, as it were, like Zappo, marketing that they're the bridge between those three things, because the goal is to have those three things, all be part of the same system, as it was essentially outlined by Trump's speech. As it relates to Bitcoin, I think that is not the answer. I think, if Bitcoin is the sound money, it should be what is transactable between people, and that robust privacy tools need to be built upon it. Because if the issue is surveillability.
For years, millions of people believed Bitcoin represented an escape hatch from the traditional financial system, a way out of centralized control, a form of money governments couldn't inflate, banks couldn't freeze, and institutions couldn't fully dominate. But what Whitney Webb is describing here is something completely different. She's describing an effort to absorb Bitcoin into the very system it was supposed to challenge. And here's the thing. Bitcoin being accepted by Wall Street is not necessarily the victory people think it is. Because once Bitcoin, stablecoins, and the US dollar all operate inside the same managed ecosystem, the system itself becomes stronger, not weaker. And if that happens, then the future of money stops being about decentralization. It becomes about integration. Most people still think the fight is between Bitcoin and the traditional financial system. But Whitney Webb argues the real plan is not to destroy Bitcoin, it's to domesticate it, to position it inside a broader architecture where digital assets, stablecoins, and dollar systems all reinforce each other instead of competing. That changes the entire conversation. Because if Bitcoin becomes primarily an institutional product held inside regulated systems, then the revolutionary promise around it starts to weaken. At that point, it no longer functions as a parallel financial structure. It becomes another layer within the existing one.
I think that needs to be tackled there. And I think, based on how this whole system's been described, the retail facing part of it would be the stable coins, and that people would just be holding but never transacting with their Bitcoin.
That distinction matters enormously. Holding Bitcoin and actually transacting with Bitcoin are two very different things. If ordinary people are pushed towards stablecoins for daily life while Bitcoin becomes a reserve asset controlled through large custodians and ETFs, then financial behavior remains highly visible and highly manageable. And once transactions themselves happen inside surveillable systems, privacy becomes much harder to preserve. That is where the story gets significantly darker. Whitney Webb repeatedly returns to one central concern: surveillance. Not because surveillance is new, but because digitized financial systems dramatically increase the scale and precision of it. Once money becomes programmable and tied to digital identity systems, financial activity stops being just economic behavior, it becomes data. And data can be monitored, categorized, restricted, and manipulated. That's why she keeps emphasizing privacy tools and the original ethos behind Bitcoin. Because without privacy, the system naturally trends toward visibility and control.
As it relates to Bitcoin, I think that is not the answer. I think, if Bitcoin is the sound money, it should be what is transactable between people, and that robust privacy tools need to be built upon it. Because if the issue is surveillability, I think that needs to be tackled there. And I think, based on how this whole system's been described, the retail facing part of it would be the stable coins, and that people would just be holding but never transacting with their Bitcoin.
That word, surveillability, is critical, because once every transaction becomes visible to institutions, governments, banks, or financial intermediaries, money stops functioning purely as a medium of exchange. It starts functioning as behavioral infrastructure. And that's the direction these systems naturally move toward. Not because every individual actor is evil, but because systems built around visibility always incentivize more visibility, more monitoring, more integration, more control. At that point, freedom becomes conditional on system approval. One of the most important points Whitney Webb makes is about timing. These systems are rarely introduced during periods of stability. They emerge during crisis. That's when populations are desperate for solutions, governments demand rapid responses, and institutions gain the political cover needed to implement changes that would otherwise face enormous resistance. And according to her, the next major debt crisis in the United States could become exactly that kind of moment.
Use it to fight for those things, or if they're going to acquiesce to the system that's being set up and is going to be pushed on people, most likely through regulation and executive orders. And it's very likely that in the next 2 years, whoever wins in November is going to be president during an unprecedented U.S. government debt crisis. And this is, if you already see it in Trump's policy, if he's in office, this is the system he's going to propose as the solution. And when there is a crisis and the solution is proposed, a lot of people, because it's a crisis and are demanding a rapid resolution to that crisis, they don't think about what's best in the long term necessarily. They're just looking for something to solve the immediate crisis.
That is the pattern viewers should focus on. Crisis creates urgency. Urgency weakens resistance. And systems that would normally trigger skepticism suddenly become politically acceptable because they are framed as emergency solutions. That's how massive restructurings happen historically, not gradually, rapidly. And the faster the crisis feels, the less time people spend questioning the long-term consequences of the proposed fix. Whitney Webb then points viewers back toward COVID, and this is where the conversation becomes extremely concrete, because she argues that many of the mechanisms people are now discussing were effectively tested during that crisis. Specifically, she points to the going direct proposal associated with BlackRock and emergency financial interventions before and during COVID. Her argument is that enormous wealth transfers occurred while ordinary businesses collapsed and major institutions became even stronger.
Very bad and very criminal. For people that aren't familiar, I would encourage them to look up the work of John Titus about the going direct reset, where essentially before there was a financial crisis related to COVID in late 2019, BlackRock created this plan that pitched to the central bankers at the Jackson Hole meeting in 2019 about going direct. And basically the idea was, during the next crisis, let's QE again, but instead of giving the QE money to public entities, let's give it straight to the private banks. That's essentially what happened. And one of the people that received those funds, those emergency funds that were meant for Main Street, was BlackRock.
That section reframes COVID economically. Instead of viewing it purely as a public health emergency, Whitney Webb is pointing viewers toward the financial consequences and asking who benefited structurally from the response itself. And numbers tell part of that story. While millions struggled economically during lockdown periods, asset prices exploded upward, major institutions consolidated power, and wealth concentration accelerated dramatically. That's why she calls attention to historical precedent, because once you recognize the pattern, future crises start looking less accidental and more politically useful for the institutions positioned closest to the financial machinery. The final warning Whitney Webb gives is not really about Bitcoin alone. It's about where all these systems converge. Stablecoins, CBDCs, tokenized deposits, digital identity systems.
I think they're going to use that as well to saddle the American people with surveillable, programmable money. Maybe it's more likely if Kamala gets in, it'll be a CBDC. But it seems quite clear that if Trump gets in, it will be a private bank digital currency, or some of these private bank issued stable coins or tokenized deposits and things like that, which again are just as surveillable and programmable as stable coins. And maybe it will be framed as a win. But a win for what, really?
Whatever form the final structure takes, the concern is the same. Programmable, surveillable money tied into centralized infrastructure. And once money becomes programmable, financial freedom changes fundamentally, because excess can be modified dynamically, restrictions can be automated, behavior can be incentivized or punished directly through the financial layer itself. That final question is devastating, because it forces viewers to separate technological progress from political consequences. A system can be efficient and still reduce freedom. It can be convenient and still increase control. And once all economic activity moves into systems capable of surveillance and programmability, the relationship between citizens and institutions changes permanently. 3 facts matter here. First, Whitney Webb is arguing that Bitcoin is not necessarily being destroyed by institutions, it's being integrated into a larger controlled ecosystem. Second, financial crises create the political conditions needed to introduce systems people would normally reject. And third, programmable money tied to digital identity and centralized infrastructure changes the meaning of financial freedom itself. So the real question is not whether digital money is coming. The real question is this: when the next major crisis hits and a fully integrated financial system is offered as the solution, how many people will realize the infrastructure for that solution was already built years earlier?